welcome to the newest episode of the Read Right to Left podcast. We took a break last month, but we're back and eager and excited to talk to you about vampire manga. I, as always, am G, joined by my wonderful co-host Ray from Whimsical Pictures.
Hi guys.
And Ray, this is certainly a topic for you. Vampire
Absolutely. Just, we always try to do a spooky topic for our October podcast. And this is the spooky topic we went with this year. And yes, vampires are both a guilty and non-guilty pleasure of mine. I've read many a vampire manga, and today we're here to talk about them. We also went with this topic specifically because we have an exciting vampire-related release that came recently, which was Volume 1 of #DRCL, #Dracula, by the Ino-san creator. What's his name?
Shinichi. Oh God.
Sakamoto?
Putting me. I believe so. You're putting me on the spot here, Ray.
Yes,
but...
Shinichi Sakamoto. We always carefully research all of our episodes.
As you can tell, we are incredibly professional, and therefore should be your first choice for manga podcasts.
Absolutely. So, I, of course, read Volume 1 of #Dracula for this podcast, and I'm pretty sure you did too as well, G, right?
Absolutely. I had to make the personal sacrifice of buying it digitally because my physical copy has not yet arrived to me because I have had major manga struggles over the last several weeks for anyone who's been following my social medias. But I have read it because it was one that I wanted to read, not just for this podcast, but just generally. I'm very interested in this mangaka's work. I've heard nothing but good things. And man, the vibes on #DRCL is just mwah! I loved it.
On point. So gothic. So, haunted, spooky vibes. Of course, if you've seen any of the spreads from this series or from Ino-san, Shinichi Sakamoto's artwork is worthy of a conversation all on its own.
Oh,
it's,
absolutely.
Incredibly lush. It's just incredibly, detail does not even begin to cover it. There is so much overflowing beauty on every single page. The character designs are much more close to realism than I think you would typically expect from manga, but also sort of have a creepy, haunted aspect to them that's really compelling. But yeah, in terms of what #DRCL is about, I mean, it's by and large a take on Dracula.
Yeah.
It takes place largely in a boarding school, British boarding school, I think.
Yes, yeah, I believe British. Although we have a very colorful mix of main cast, who are all based off of characters from Bram Stoker's original novel. For any of those listening who haven't read Dracula or haven't followed along with Dracula Daily, there is a cowboy in that novel that you may not be aware of. It's much more than just there's a creepy vampire. It's much more I am a British man who is just utterly confused by all of these foreign locals. And Arthur's not the smartest cookie in the jar. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing how this particular manga plays out. It also features the I don't know how to quite describe the travel of the ship, the dieter, whatever it is called, the voyage. That's the word I'm looking for. Which is how Dracula made it to England in the first place. Which this is not how the novel goes, but this is all part of the Dracula lore in the novel. We are in a very vampire-like season of life, it feels. There's just a lot of vampire media coming out, and it seems just perfect for this spooky season. And in saying all of that, you don't actually need to know any background info on the novel Dracula to be able to enjoy this manga. I feel it might help, but it's very much got its own vibe. It's doing a lot of different things, and I look forward to seeing how these quirky group of teens figure out this ongoing mystery, a monster happening in their quiet seaside boarding school.
Yeah, it's also very gender, which is worth
very gender, very gender. Again, not
as
atypical.
All the best vampire media is.
Absolutely, which it makes Shinichi Sakamoto perfect for this, because his other series, from what I understand, is also very gender, so it seems like a perfect fit.
Do you recommend? I don't feel like there's a lot to go into, like a lot of detail to go into with the plot so far, because we're just sort of getting things set up, getting our mystery set up, getting our characters set up. But yeah, definitely one to keep an eye on going forward.
As part of the vampire oeuvre of manga, Ray, as a connoisseur yourself, how would you say that hashtag DRCL fits within the very broad vampire genre? Because we truly do have all sorts of vampire media. Everything from, spicy bodice ripper style of stuff.
Yeah.
both heterosexual and gay. It's not just the hets who are enjoying their vampire lovers. To all the complete opposite side of the spectrum of just like super classic horror, psychological thriller stuff, sort of like that happiness style.
Yeah. To just grotesque, action beat 'em up, slasher kind of stuff.
To also slice of life. Oh, I'm a daily life of Dracula, and you're like, oh, okay,
silly, clumsy vampire girl.
or boy.
That's the popular one right now, right? Is Kyugetsuki wa Sugu Shinu. Is like a shonen gag manga. It's one of the things that I love about vampires, right? You really can do any fucking thing you want with them. You can find vampires in any genre, whatever genre you fancy. And I just love the versatility of them as a monster. But yeah, in terms of hashtag DRCL, it's definitely on the more classic horror side of things. As we've said, it's a take on Bram Stoker's Dracula. The Dracula in question is certainly more of the ancient horror kind of vibes. There's some very grotesque body horror involving moss, fungi.
Oh yeah.
Which seems to be part of how this spreads. It reminded me of The Last of Us quite a bit. And in that, vein, there's certainly, a lot of vampire stuff that I haven't read in manga, because it would be impossible to read all of it. But what it reminded me the most of in vibe is what you just mentioned, which is Happiness, by Shuzo Oshimi. 10-volume series. starts off as a pretty standard, like, vampirism as a metaphor for puberty kind of thing.
Yeah,
With
for sure.
a teenage boy, like, getting bit by a sexy lady vampire in the middle of the night, gets jumped. And, like, his body changes in ways that he doesn't quite know how to come to terms with, and in ways that are frightening.
And then he discovers he is Spider-Man. No, he discovers...
Yeah.
Sorry.
He's Spider-Man, except he's suddenly really into, like, girls who are on their periods, which is
it's a kink.
a
It's
very
fine.
Oshimi detail to include.
Yes.
But that's the first couple volumes, maybe, like, charitably the first two, but really the first one.
Yeah.
And things go from there. This series gets real wild, real fast. It spans a very large cross-section of time, since it does feature immortal characters. It also features mortal characters who we follow through their whole lives. We get into, like, serial killers and cult stuff and child experimentation, a lot of body horror.
Yeah.
This is another series that I think is extremely notable for its art. Obviously, Oshimi is always an incredibly beautiful, I'd say unsettling artist, and I think Happiness is, like, the farthest that Oshimi has ever been able to, like, go with their art. In terms of just, like, there being a lot of supernatural elements that they can explore with it. Yeah, just, like, the way that this thing is, like, laid out, the paneling is wild. It's very expressionistic. The things, like, the backgrounds, the characters, the way the character sees gets distorted, wildly out of control as the character is going through, like, different mental anguish and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The way the night sky, the way that the vampires see it is portrayed is, like, really beautiful in particular. It's definitely taking some inspiration from, like, Van Gogh.
Yeah, it's a really, like a lot of Oshimi's works, I find, as someone who's read some, not all of his stuff, but certainly quite a large chunk of his catalog. It's very much about, there's a lot of feeling to that. Like, a lot of it is about reader reaction, or, like, the expression of emotion and impact of character emotion on the reader. That's how I would describe it. There's, I don't want to just say it's like Oshimi's manga's vibes, but it kind of is, especially in Happiness. Like, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of plot-related stuff, a lot of character-related stuff, but ultimately, like, it could just exist without a large overarching plot, which for parts of it certainly feels very disconnected, because, as you mentioned, Rai, it does cover such a large expanse of time that it's like there's pockets of consecutive story, and obviously we're following just one or two particular characters throughout the entirety of it, but each kind of segment feels very self-contained as well, in a way that plays to the larger narrative of now existing in this way completely outside of time, right? Which obviously, when you're an immortal undead creature, you are completely disconnected from the ties of mortality in ways that, for like humans who are very mortal in all of the bad ways, is very much an adjustment period, which I think Oshimi does particularly well in this series. It is something that can get hand waved a little bit, for just ease of, or just genre of the media.
Yeah.
But you know, there is a reality of, and an impact of, a human normal person turning into something that ostensibly is almost completely different from in fundamental ways, right? Like, they look the same, but the idea of feasting on blood and not being able to go out in sunlight and all of these other aspects, and again, everyone around you will die because we all have mortal lifespans. That can have a real impact, psychological as well as physical impact on you. Psychological more so than physical. I think for Oshimi, who is very much a mangaka who thrives on psychological genre stories, it really suits him that was the direction he decided to take with this particular series.
Yeah, there's definitely I mean, within like vampire fiction, there's like certain themes that get sort of returned to over and over again. And one of those is certainly like exploring the meaning of life and aging and mortality, specifically by contrasting that with a being who isn't alive and yet exists as though they were living, who doesn't age and who is not mortal. And that's definitely one of the biggest themes of this particular series. In that we almost like see vampires portrayed as like an inverted like humanity, like that they're sort of equal and opposite in a way, almost like looking in a mirror. And we have sort of that through Oshimi talks about like wanting to make this series sort of an ensemble cast with a lot of a rotating cast of narrators, essentially. But there's two main narrators throughout the series, one of whom is the boy from the first volume who gets turned into a vampire and then is a vampire throughout the rest of the series. And the other is a girl who he befriends, who sort of accepts his weird story that he tells her about vampires, because she's lonely, and she doesn't really have any friends, and she is sort of drawn in by the fantasy of it all. And she's sort of the other narrator who we follow through from teenagerhood through her death. And so we see that contrast between her growing up and just sort of, even though she had this weird time when she was a teenager, where not only did she obviously meet and befriend a vampire and meet some other vampires as well, but she also was witness to some very traumatic events, and not just witness, but like she has a run-in with a serial killer who is obsessed with vampires, and she ends up with like PTSD from this. She spends like a good few years of her life not leaving her house, and we see how the fact that she's able to grow and change and age, and that her memories become vague after time, that she's able to move on from this, that she's able to get a normal job, make normal friends, and meet a totally normal guy who seems like a real sweetheart. And then, of course, she has a second run-in with this serial killer who has, like, 10 years in the future, he's started his own cult, because he's managed to get his hands on a vampire, one of the ones that we knew from the first half of the series. And so she's sort of re-traumatized by those events, in a big way. Like, oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy. And that very sweet man that she's met, and started dating, gets wrapped up in all of it as well. But, again, you know, she, like, all of these events, they pass. There's only one survivor from this suicide cult, but he grows up, and eventually he's able to sort of normalize, find a place in the world, even though he's been born and raised within this cult. You know, he grows and he changes and he moves on, and so does she, for a second time. And meanwhile, we watch sort of our vampire protagonist looking in from the outside, feeling like he would basically be doing nothing good for her life by being in it in any capacity. You know, never really able to change, just going back and doing the same things over and over and over again. So.
Well, that's the thing, right? When vampire, well, I mean, in any kind of media where we look at the mortality of humans, humans by nature are very flexible and adaptable because, you know, we can. It's an incredible thing, but humanity and people as individuals can get used to pretty much any situation, because of just the normalization of it. And so part of that is because we only have so many years on this earth, right? We only have, you know, 80 years on average to kick around on this blue marble, and then you're eating dirt. But it's because of that, you know, we don't have, there's, for what feels like a really long time for us, years or decades of growing and accepting and coming to terms with trauma, when you compare that to a vampire who has the rest of eternity ahead of them, it feels like a blink of an eye. And truly 5 years or 10 years or 25 years is not a huge amount of time in the grand scheme of things, but on an individual level, that is a huge amount of time. So it's always interesting to see, like, that comparison of the just sheer sense of time difference. This isn't something that just happens with vampires. Obviously, any kind of immortal creature. I
mean, right now we've got the anime out for Free Run, right? Which that's a huge theme in that series as well.
Well, I always remember there's this particular episode of Natsume where the mountain has a much different sense of time compared to like the other yokai, because it's existed for, you know, tens of thousands of years. So it's
there's a Mushishi episode as well about a tree that's similar.
So these are not unique themes to any particular monster or genre or whatever, but it is one that comes up a lot in vampire manga and media, because it's just innate with the function of them as a creature, as a, you know, entity. I don't know what kind of word we want to use for vampires. Monster feels maybe too harsh.
I think monster is the most appropriate, because, like, I think when I'm, like, comparing, like, a vampire series that's dealing with these themes to, say, that Natsume episode about a mountain spirit, like, in that case, like, there's nothing unnatural about a mountain spirit living for a very long time. And I think that what makes vampires monstrous is that element of being unnatural, that element of being an aberration to what the world is supposed to be. And in that sense, it's like whatever vampire like media you're looking at, and I'm sort of stealing this a little bit from there's a YouTuber called Maven of the Eventide who does like reviews of vampire books. And she always says, like, you know, when you're looking at a piece of vampire media, what you're looking at first thematically is like, what do the vampires represent? Like, what is the vampiric, what is the vampirizing force in these characters' lives? What is it that is draining their life force, making their lives harder to live? To me, within happiness, that's a lot of time it's a fear of growing up.
Yeah.
It's like unhealthy obsession with mortality. We see that coming up within a lot of characters, whether it's the serial killer who's causing all these problems for people, or the cultists. The woman who is our female protagonist, who is afraid of growing up and leaving the male protagonist behind. The male protagonist who experiences this very monstrous form of puberty that frightens him.
Yeah.
Like, so to me, it is that sort of sense of unnaturalness, that sense of unhealthy vampiric forces that makes, like, the take on sort of mortality versus immortality different in vampire fiction, I guess. Like, it's a specific like flavor of that.
Yeah. No, and I totally, that explanation really makes sense, and I agree with that. I think it's but vampires just inherently, because they've been around for, I mean, they've been around as a concept for a lot longer than the Dracula novel, but obviously the Dracula novel like distilled it into a specific idea or a specific representation. It's all because a lot of these supernatural creatures, whether they be from folklore or a more structured, you know, horror novel, because they've been around so long, and because like the idea of them as a monster has been used for, at this point, hundreds of years, they are and obviously we've said at the beginning of this episode that there's this huge variation in genre for this sort of thing, that there is media that like takes all of that very poignant and pointed exploration of characters and you know, the immortality of them, and then there's stuff that is like, they're treated more as just like a quirky like person who just can't go out in the daytime. So it's like, oh, how would that, like, maybe they are just a neat, so they don't leave their house and like this is their day-to-day life with their butler or like whatever it is, right? So they
certainly there's like varying levels of thought being put into vampire lore depending on what work you're talking about. But,
well, precisely, and that's why, like, I initially was like, I do agree that monster is probably the best word, because they are unnatural in the sense of like they don't fit in the natural world in the same way that a rock spirit or whatever does. But also there's so much media that like doesn't look at them as monsters. They're just like, you know, they're just a guy.
Well, it's interesting within manga in particular how a lot of times you see vampires just sort of pulled into the fold of yokai. Like, they just become yokai, which is interesting. Something like Rosario Vampire does this. There's just like Western monsters and Japanese folkloric like yokai and stuff just together, all in the harem. They're all just hanging out, titties out, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, as you do. I find it interesting because I know we had a question kind of regarding how.
Are you talking about the one about like the history of vampire mythology in Japan?
Yes.
Before you go on, just so people have context of what we are referencing, we got a very thoughtful question from @Sunlit Lake. It's several tweets in a row. It says, given that, to my knowledge and Wikipedia checking, Japan has no vampire mythology of their own, what do you think makes the mythos so much fun for a mangaka to explore? Is it simply Hagio's influence, referring to the Po clan from the 1970s? Or is there more to its romantic and erotic endurance, especially among women? I'll just read the whole thing right now. In fact, that's also an interesting question. Why do you think there is so much love for vampires among media aimed at women, especially given the themes of assault? The only male-targeted vampire manga I can think of in recent years is #DRCL Midnight Children, which is a seinen. I would say there's a ton of shonen and seinen vampire manga. It's just that it's not necessarily what I read. So,
yeah.
But Happiness is shonen, I believe. Desatsu shonen.
The one which shall remain nameless from Denpa, that's a seinen, I believe.
Yep.
There's
a particular Yuri vampire manga series that from the covers looks like it might be really good, but if you know anything about the creator, it's maybe a series worth avoiding.
There's a lot of vampire. Yeah, there's a lot of vampire. Sorry to cut you off. Right. There's a lot of vampire series, seinen and shonen around. And not just from recent years. Obviously, you mentioned Rosario Vampire as one. There's Mars Red. That's a seinen and not good, so I don't recommend it. But that's also out there and existing. Yeah, there's
I mean, Seraph at the End, my long-term cause of my personal suffering, is a shonen series. Call of the Night is a huge one right now.
Yes,
that's a shonen series. Vanitas, which this person mentions in their next tweet, is certainly, targets a female demographic as well, but it does also have a large male readership.
Yeah.
So they do go on to say, and technically Vanitas, I guess, but I mean, gestures to its everything. Yes. Vanitas is an incredibly bisexual series, and I think we will get to it.
We will get to it. But to that point, like, there is, what I was going to say, it's, I don't think it's inherently surprising that vampire manga or vampires as an idea are super popular in Japan. And they're super popular everywhere, obviously. Like, Twilight was a thing. The idea of vampires are just that little bit of, like, they're not too, like, unhuman that, like, they're it's baby's first monster fucker, right? Like, they're human enough that, like, you can feel like they're sexy, right? They have an inherent eroticism to them that, like, the Swamp Thing doesnment have necessarily, or, like, even werewolves, like,
unless you're not a coward.
I know. I'm not saying, like, this is not me kink shaming but like, there's a reason that, like, romance novels, the bodice rippers, non-manga bodice rippers are always like, being bred by the werewolf, or, like, bitten by love, and it's about vampire, like, billionaires, vampires, werewolves, and maybe a sexy alien are, like, the top absolutely the top for those sorts of, like, fantasy. Oh, he's dangerous, but it's fine because he loves me. He's not gonna hurt me. Like, playing into that fantasy, right? And the idea of, like, oh, and he's not even human, so it's even more dangerous than just, like, a weird abuser that is normally, like, the CEO or the billionaire. It's a fantasy, right? So that's why it appeals to female readers. It's why Twilight was so popular, even though it wasn't inherently, like, written well. It's that idea of, like, oh, he could kill me, but he's not going to, which I think is just, like, there's an element that for a lot of women or AFAB people, they have been raised to either, like, fit into this you need to be protected style of, like, place in society, but also, like, typically women and AFAB people are running households. They're doing everything. They've got work, they're usually running a household, they've got a million different stressors in their life. They just want to relinquish control to a sexy vampire every so often and not have to deal with it.
And there's also, like, you know, a lot of, like, okay, as a long-term vampire enjoyer, there's multiple levels to this fantasy, and depending on which, like, female-oriented, maybe more romance-oriented vampire literature you've chosen, it may, like, focus on different aspects more or less. There's certainly, like, the ones that focus on, you know, the very literal bodice ripping, like those, like, themes of assault and the like that you at Sunlit Lake mentions. That tends to not really be my thing, but it is for a lot of people. That's, you know, you don't need vampires to find that in romance fiction. It's everywhere. The idea of, you know, some mysterious stranger coming to you in the night and just ravishing you is, I mean, it's a fantasy. And there's also an element of, protection. Like, a lot of times with, like, vampire stuff, it's like, you meet this sexy, mysterious guy, and through him, you learn his terrible secret, and you learn that there's this whole world out there of, like, vampires that, like, you know, and now that you know about it, you're in danger.
You're in so much danger.
He has to protect you because he's stronger than you. There's also an element of, like, nurturing a lot of times, where it's this idea of, like, you know, I have to have this incredibly awesome vampire bitey sex with this guy to keep him alive. I'm the reason he's alive. And then there's also the fantasy of, like, you know, maybe you're kind of disillusioned with real guys as they are right now, and you have maybe a fantasy about, like, you know, an old-fashioned guy who's chivalrous and opens the door for you. And, you know, vampires can provide that because the guides are literally 300 years old, you know? You know,
and he's probably
right?
probably some sexy, vague European, right? Like, oh, he's not like my husband Jeff from Minnesota, right? Like, there's some.
It's so funny. This is like the stereotypical reason to love Takarazuka too. Like, he's not like my dead. Yeah, this Otokoyaku is so much cooler than any real man. He wouldn't do me like my deadbeat husband who always works until 3 a.m. Yeah, I mean, so, like, if we're talking about, like, romance fiction, I think there's, like, quite a few obvious reasons why vampires are popular, you know? there's a lot of different angles to the fantasy.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's
Um,
like that. It makes sense as to why there's a larger probably demographic of women who engages with vampire fiction in every form. Not not inherently just for sexy stuff, because as a woman who enjoys horror, and as you know, you are the same, I'm sure, Ray. There's like
oh
other
yeah,
cool elements about vampires, but like
yeah.
it doesn't
I think
surprise
like
me that the sexy European appeals to women, right?
um, yeah. But in terms of like them becoming popular in Japan,
Mm.
you're right. As far speaking to at Sunlit Lake, they are right. As far as I know, that like essentially vampire lore, like the Western concept of a vampire, sort of came over to Japan with stuff like Bram Stoker's Dracula, with like early cinema as well.
Mm.
And of course, like they would have had stuff like the Chinese, like Kyongshi. Like there's like myths about blood sucking monsters the world over, but certainly like that Western conception, that more like
Mm.
sexy conception,
Yeah, yeah.
sexual deviance kind of thing. Vampires came about with more like Western media coming over to Japan. Um, but like, I mean, I think it's compelling, so that's why it spreads, kind of thing. It's stuff like Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, making vampires sexy. It's I mean, stuff crosses over like across the ocean all the time. Like,
Yeah.
how are you going to explain the fact that one of the biggest, most popular, most rampant tropes in Japanese BL right now is ABO? Like, where do you think that came from?
Because it hits all the kinks, and Japan loves embracing the kinks. But also, like, I find that maybe, as you said, like this stuff is very cross cultural anyway. It's very universal, but Japan as a like society has always had like yokai and monsters and things in it inherently. Like there's always been part of quote unquote popular belief. So like the idea of what is ostensibly like very often gets called European yokai, i.e. vampires and werewolves and things, is just like that's just an extension of that. In the same way that there's like tanuki and foxes that can do magic and stuff. It's like, yeah, of course.
Humans and
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh yeah, that's sure. Yeah. That's fine. That's normal, right? Everyone has that. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
It fits very neatly into like Japanese horror tropes, because a lot of time like Japanese horror is very focused on like human psychology, on like old objects taking on lives of their own.
Yeah.
About like melancholy spirits trapped within different things. Like I feel like vampires slot into that pretty naturally. So.
Yeah, exactly.
And Japanese people are always happy to welcome new monsters into the fold. Yeah, and I mean, it does help, as at Sunlit Lake mentions, that early in shoujo manga's history, we did have a very influential vampire series, which I was actually going to segue into from Happiness, because Happiness has a theme of immortal teenagers, and so does this. If that's okay with you, G.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay. We now have the whole original run available in English in 2 oversized volumes. This is Moto Hagio's The Po Clan, which means a whole lot to me for reasons that I'm sure our listeners are well aware of. But yeah, so the original run of this series was 5 volumes. and it's told asynchronously. It's told out of order. So the volumes that we got in English are in original publishing order. So as they would have been published in magazine, which means that they are out of chronological order, the stories within it.
Yes, yeah.
The Poe clan is about, it's about a boy named Edgar Portnell, who at the age of 14 is turned into a vampirella, because we need to have just a slightly more extra name for our vampires, because this is 70s shoujo. But he gets turned into a vampirella by the king of the Poe clan, which is a clan of vampirellas. At the age of 14. They were supposed to wait until he came of age, but there was a sudden attack on the clan that necessitated that he be made into a vampirella early, essentially. Later on, he ends up turning his little sister, Maribel, into a vampirella when she turns 13. And like 100 years after that, he meets a boy named Alan Twilight. So we've got Edgar and Alan of the Poe clan. It's a little gimmick there. He meets Alan Twilight, who he senses a kindred spirit in. After some unfortunate events result in the death of his sister, and the sort of vampire parents that he'd been traveling with, he ends up turning Alan into a vampirella as a replacement for Maribel. And things go from there. So, obviously, he spent over 100 years together with the Baron and Baroness Portnell and with his sister, and then he ends up spending well over a century together with Alan as well. And each sort of chapter within the Poe clan is a vignette within Edgar's long, long life. Generally either featuring Maribel or featuring Alan. And because there's a very short period of time where those two overlap, but
yes,
and they're told out of order, so which ends up like creating this sense that time doesn't really matter, which is of course very true for the characters within the series. You know, their life is a series of moments that doesn't really have an end. So yeah. And we have, those 5 volumes that were published in the 70s, we have in English. There's also a sequel series that started in 2018, which continues the story, also fills in some gaps. Like, it continues to be out of order.
Yeah.
But it also has a 2016 storyline, so it continues how things happened after Edith.
Yeah, it's Poe clan is quintessential classic shoujo, right? Like it's one of those titles that you and I, as Year 24 fans, we were wanting anyway. But it's been really interesting to see this engagement with classic shoujo. But as kind of already previously discussed and mentioned as well, like it really, vampires and this sense of time not mattering, really fits into this, the whimsy is maybe not the right word for it, but like that was very much the vibe of a lot of 70s shoujo. So like the idea of vampires who exist outside of chronological time just suits it really well. It's really easy to put them into or insert them into a story or a timeline that already is kind of a little bit is ready to engage with like very unusual or styles of storytelling, right? Like a lot of, how do I want to say this? It really engages in a different style of storytelling that it just really feels like classic shoujo manga.
Yeah.
And maybe that is just the bias of this being a really prominent work from that period and from an extremely prominent creator, and certainly one that captured, not at the time, but has become a classic within Hagio's, very broad scope of work. That I'm looking at this in hindsight, but whether it was sci-fi, whether it was, this more romantic style of vignette, whether it was, just a more anything, like the whimsy and the way that the story engages with the audience was a lot more willing to be experimental, maybe, which for this kind of story just works really well. It was a good calculated maybe decision to use vampires, because you could write this story without, like, I mean, you wouldn't, it would be completely different, but you could have like this very queer historical vignette style of tragedy without there being vampires, but the fact that there is vampires like makes it work that much more, and it also gives the longevity to the story as well. We've spoken previously about Hagio's works kind of exist, especially her historical fiction type of stuff, Poclan and Heart of Thomas, kind of existing outside of quote unquote history. Like you can't necessarily put a pin in where, like, oh, this was definitely 1872. Like, it doesn't matter, right? That's not the point of it. And so timeless creatures, timeless beings really work well for that, because it's like, oh yeah, it's just vibes, sometimes we're in Victorian England, sometimes we're in 1970s, sometimes we're in 1923, and you're like, okay, cool, that's cool, just whatever. And I think as a creator, that's a really fun thing to do as well. You're not shackled to one particular setting or time period, which is why I absolutely wouldn't fault Hagio for coming back to the story and like just having fun with it and putting like, oh, what if these characters were in 2016? They got iPhones now. Like, it's just like, it's just interesting. It's a fun thought experiment, if nothing else.
Yeah, the sequel's fun because, like, her style and what she is concerned with has changed so much. So it's like, you see a lot more fleshing out of the lore, which is very sort of, what I need it to be when I need it to be. Like in the original 5 volumes, but she very much like takes it and fleshes it out in a more sci-fi author kind of way. There's like a 1/5 column in one of it's included in the second Fantagraphics volume, but it's where she's just kind of musing about what happens to the vampires' clothes when they die, because they turn into dust. And she's just like, it would be really unromantic if, like, a vampire turned to dust and they were wearing, like, modern underwear and it just was left behind. And it ended up in the British Museum, like, as Vampirella underwear. So I think there's just a pocket dimension that opens up when a vampire dies, and all their clothes just go in there. But she takes that and runs with it in the sequel, where it's like, some Vampirella are capable of, like, dimension hopping, and Edgar ends up being able to do that, because he is a very powerful Vampirella. But stuff like that is really fun. She's definitely more, I would say she was always like really having a ton of fun, like looking up like historical realia and like you know, fashion plates and the like. Depending on the era she was drawing, she really had a lot of fun, like, you know, making sure the suits were era appropriate. But the sequel is much more like, you know, this is this historical period in time, and these events were happening around them. So that's kind of interesting. But in terms of the Poe clan, I think something that's interesting about it, the inspiration she had to do vampires came from, at least she says, is Shotaro Ishinomori short story about vampire sisters. Which, you know, we'll never see in English.
Cry.
She really liked that short story, so she was originally going to sort of just do the same thing, like have a story about vampire sisters. But we know our Hagio. She feels kind of uncomfortable putting her thoughts in a female character's mouth, so she ended up switching the genders of the characters to boys. And we ended up with our eternal bisexual vampire boyfriends. But also, like, a big part of why she ended up writing the Poe clan was because she'd just finished an exchange in England. And she was just going through a major Tea-aboo phase. She was really into England, and she wanted to write about British characters, sipping tea, you know, doing British things. So, and you definitely get that a lot. There's a sense of, like, there's a lot of, like, references to British fairy tales and folklore. Characters just, like, reciting random, like, Mother Goose rhymes. Just for the vibes, you know? And I feel like a lot of what the series looks like visually, like, there's a lot of elements of, like, Victorian Gothic aesthetic.
Yeah.
And then there's also a lot of elements of, like, fairy tale aesthetic. Especially once Edgar and Alan are, like, together. There's a lot of, like, fairy tale aesthetic going on. Like the story where they're raising a little girl in the woods. Or, like, the story where Edgar meets this piano teacher who seems to be lost in her own little world. And I think that sort of adds to this element of, like, being out of time, that we're sort of in a fairy tale.
As some, like, said, I do think that part of the popularity with this style of vampire is very much informed by Hagio. You know, it's been a huge influence. It's certainly one that informs kind of the larger discussion, and obviously shouldn't be ignored because it has been hugely influential for decades and decades and decades and decades.
And I wanted to mention, like, in terms of that idea of, like, what do the vampires, like, represent? What is the vampiric force here? Certainly a lot of the drama throughout the series, a lot of the brooding comes from the fact that these are, like, 14-year-old children who have been frozen in time. Even though they weren't supposed to. And I actually wanted to quote, it's a rough translation by me, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But this is from, like, an NHK special that's fairly recent. I think it's from 2018, the same year the sequel started, and the Takarazuka version aired. That was called, like, Hagiomoto's The Poe Clan in 100 Minutes. And she says about, about Edgar. She's talking about, like, what inspired the character. And she says, there are people who society hates and denies as heretics, but those people have hearts too. I was always a dropout. My parents would always say to me, Why can't you do anything right? For those of us who can't fit into the educational system as it is, people really act like we don't have hearts. They act like they can say anything at all to us, like they can educate us any way they want, like it's okay whether they call us stupid or bad or tell us to just go die. But it really hurts to be the kid hearing those things, because of course we do have hearts after all. So it was from the point of view of one of those kids that I drew Edgar. So there's definitely, I think, this thematic through line that's really obviously going to speak to teenagers and tweenagers who feel like left out, who feel like they're too weird and they don't fit in and they're never going to fit in, that they can see in Edgar sort of someone else who society has just sort of decided is wrong.
Yeah.
He just shouldn't be there. He shouldn't exist, you know? Why do you live, demon? Kind of thing. And that's sort of a through line throughout the series. It's what Alan and Edgar initially see in each other. And it keeps coming back and coming back that, like, they can't let people know anything about themselves because they'll just get killed.
Yeah.
You know, people will bring out the pitchforks and torches. And I think it's important to that end that the Vampirella are pretty vulnerable. They're not like, sometimes vampires are like, you can't kill them with anything. But like, you know, a Vampirella will pretty much snap in a strong enough breeze. So
Yeah.
they wilt roses, which is super goth, you know. They can be stabbed. They can, you know, they are frightened by religious items. And I also think that this really contributes to, like, queer readers in particular finding a lot to connect to here. Not even just because Edgar and Alan have a very ambiguous relationship that has led this to be considered one of the first BL series. You know, even though they're not, like, quote-unquote canon or whatever, like, they are. Right? They are. But it's like on top of that, there's this element of, like, you know, being cast out, being considered heretical and unholy that I think speaks to queer readers a lot. So.
Absolutely. And I think that's religiosity, the religious aspect of vampires, of that, like, unclean or, like, unholy, that's the word, unholy monster is something, again, across all the modern iterations of you know, post-Dracula vampire world.
Yeah, actually, I think that sort of, like, religiosity, especially, like, all the Christian and Catholic motifs in the Poe clan are sort of unique. Like, Vanitas gets into it a bit as well, but it's, like, not necessarily something that shows up in manga versions of vampires a lot.
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, it makes sense because it's not like a Christian country.
Exactly.
But I think it, you know, it does speak to that sort of universality of, like, this idea of living a lifestyle that's considered deviant by like dominant forces within culture. Like, it doesn't have to be like Christianity. Like, you know, just because Japan isn't a Christian country doesn't mean that it's, like, super easy to just be out and proud and openly queer wherever you go. Like, so, like, those, like, that Christian imagery can, like, represent just, like, anything that's making you feel like an outcast. I guess since I mentioned it, we can go on to Vanitas if you'd like.
Sure. Vanitas is an interesting one. This is, for those who don't know, from the same creator as Pandora Hearts. So it's a shonen, but it's very much...
The full title is The Case Study of Vanitas, for those who want to look it up.
Yes, yeah.
Go on.
It's,
Sorry.
no problem. So it's very much it's a shonen manga, but it certainly is more geared towards the like female readers. It doesn't hide its very queer will they won't they relationship between the two main male characters.
It's a buddy cop dynamic.
Yeah, in a weird, well, I say weird, in an interesting steampunk-esque version of historical France, which is again just vibes, great setting,
Yes.
love it.
The aesthetic here on point.
So good. But this is the story of like vampires kind of live openly in society, but they're still kind of,
well, sort of, like,
sort of.
If they're in like main, like real world Paris, they kind of have to be a little secretive, because the church has convinced people that all the vampires are dead.
Yeah.
But if they live in like the vampire world, which is like the parallel universe version of Paris called Altus Paris, then they just kind of hang out.
Just live their lives. It's certainly it's one that I think has really, I mean, obviously we mentioned that it's a shonen that certainly doesn't hide away from its female fans. But it is one that I think crosses or treads out that line really well. It has enough action in there that even the bros who are like, no man, there's just those crazy fangirls talking about, you know, in just completely oblivious to any homoeroticism there may or may not be. I think even they would enjoy this series and maybe learn a little bit about themselves and learn to embrace the gay. We live in hope.
I definitely felt like I'd been spirited away back to like 2008 when like looking at the comment sections for like the anime adaptation of the series and just seeing a bunch of dude bros like arguing over whether they're gay or not. And I'm like, obviously, my lads, they are bisexual. They both have a lady love who they care about very much, and they also care about each other. And their lady loves also care about each other, and it's a beautiful bisexual polyamorous polycule. Obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously. These people don't know what they're talking about. Obviously.
This is settled. This is just it's just canon, you know? But yeah. This series is great. It's just like I caught up with the series because I was a bit behind on the manga, so I caught up with it for this episode of the podcast, and ended up rewatching the anime with my partner because it's just like every time I read a new volume of the series, I just get re-obsessed with it. It's just fun. It's so much fun. It's a good time. It's yeah. It feels very like 2010s. Like even though the anime came out last year, like it definitely feels just a little bit retro.
For sure.
You know, that's like the era I grew up on anime. That's when I was watching the most anime and the most into it. So it kind of just makes me feel like a teenager, you know, obsessively pirating episodes of Black Butler. So but I really like this series, like not just because it's nostalgic, but I just think it's a really solidly put together series. Like it's very coherent in ways that Pandora Hearts definitely wasn't always. It's beautiful. The entire series, the character designs, the backgrounds, the vehicle designs are stunning. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Mochizuki Jun is very much like she is really good about lifting up her assistants. She recognizes them by name at the end of every volume and points out like the things that they've been working on. So she's got one of them who's really got a knack for vehicle design, and that's what that assistant does is the vehicle design. Um, she also was like one of the first creators to put her series on hiatus, and she did so for the pandemic. Um, and she did so specifically because she was worried about her assistants commuting to work when it was unsafe for them. So um, I always like pointing that out because I feel like a lot of mangaka kind of try to avoid talking about the fact that they have assistants.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and I really appreciate the mangaka who are very like forward about the fact that they have a team of assistants and like also, you know, use the platform that they have to like acknowledge the assistant's skills as artists. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's really neat. So that's a tangent, but so the series is beautiful. The setting is beautiful. It's France. It's like Victorian era. I mean, Victorian is England, but it's the late 19th century. It's steampunk. It's gorgeous. Everyone's super well dressed. uh, but like, yeah, in general, in terms of like pacing, it moves along really quickly. It slows down when it needs to. The character beats feel like they come at the right times. It's just a very well crafted series, I think. Good entertainment, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's fun. It's got great heart. It's got great character beats. It's got great action for those who are so inclined. It's just overall just as you said, a really good time, very fun. It's a good way to spend an afternoon reading and or watching that series. And yeah, it certainly has the feel of a nostalgic youth, right? Wherein we were all watching Black Butler and D Grey Man and just, enjoying ourselves and getting caught up in ship wars. And now we're old ladies and we don't do that anymore, but
And
it
we
just
don't do
feels
that
like...
anymore because the correct answer is right there before our eyes. Polyamory
But
solves everything, damn it.
Well, exactly, right? Why can't we just have more thruples in this world? I don't know.
Truly.
A question for the ages. But it just is always so much fun, kind of revisiting something from which is a modern day take, I guess, or it just has that feeling of nostalgia despite being very contemporary.
I also think that much in the same way that the Poe clan is super queer, this series
Mm.
also is. This series also prominently features the Catholic Church. Um,
Yes.
and they're not the good guys. um, I mean, there's a couple who are decent, but they're not the most pious of chasseurs.
No,
Um,
no.
so, uh, the church in general is definitely an antagonistic force within the series. Um, and we also have, like, I think the lore for the vampires in the series is very interesting. Because the vampires don't, like, turn each other, they're just sort of born. Um, and they're specifically born because, like, the world of the case study of Vanitas is essentially made out of math. Like, there's
Yeah.
there's a matrix that can theoretically be accessed that contains all of the world's formulas, the equations that make up every single thing in the universe. Um, and if you can figure out how to access that matrix, then it's possible to alter essentially the DNA of the very universe itself. And we have sort of an alternate history. This is the breaking point, right? The point where our world and this world like separated in their continuities. And that was a couple hundred years before the series takes place, whatever. And basically it was this like very zealous scientist who wanted to play God, ended up figuring out how to access the world formulas, and he just kind of fucked with them, you know?
You know, as they do. Those bloody scientists, I swear.
He's like, you know what? I think I can do this better. And he changed the map, and it caused horrific calamities the world over, as one can expect. It also caused, like, some of the things in our universe to just end up a little wrong, you know?
Yeah.
So coal got fucked up and turned into this like super element called astermite that now has made it possible for this like steampunk utopia to exist, and these like crazy airships and everything. All the steampunk technology is run on astermite. And it also created vampires. So the formula for human beings just got a little fucked up. And these people who had red eyes and thirsted for blood suddenly started appearing. Just as a new subspecies of humanity.
Yeah, again, as you do.
Because they are sort of aberrations created by fucking up the world formulas, they are closer to the world formulas than normal humans are, so they're capable of, like, accessing them and fucking with them themselves. That's sort of this universe's magic system. And they also sort of inhabit that alternate world that has the world formulas in it, which is called Altus. And it's like, it's just like Paris, but goth. And all the vampires live there. And there was this big war between the vampires and the humans. The humans won, chased the vampires back to Altus. And the church decided to convince all of the humans that the vampires are all dead. But they're not. They're vibing. Some of them are vibing in the human world.
Yeah, I mean, iconic, really.
See, this is the greatest proof that this is a queer series, and that the vampires in this are inherently queer, because the vampires literally exist because someone was bad at math. And as we know, gays are bad at math. It's science.
Bad at math, bad at driving. It's a...
I bet the vampires are bad at driving. I don't know.
That's why they've got all those horse-drawn carriages, right? You just leave it to the animals.
Obviously,
They'll figure it out.
They'll figure it out. Certainly Noah would be a bad driver. He, is a very distractible gentleman.
There's no eyes on the road for that boy.
Nope. Eyes everywhere but the road. Yeah, but I think it's interesting, this idea of, like, in this case, the vampires are, like, their very existence is heretical, right? Like, they shouldn't exist because they're fucking with nature. So, like, I think that is very compelling, and I think it's particularly compelling, again, to, like, queer readers and queer viewers. this idea that like just by existing as you are, there's something inherently wrong with you, that needs to be rectified by destroying you, like by writing you out of the human race. That's certainly something that I think speaks to, I mean, a lot of different groups of people, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that, like, if we're talking about, like, the vampiric force that these vampires represent, I think one of them is grief. Like, there's a huge, like, thematic through line about grief and dealing with grief in healthy versus unhealthy ways. But I also think there's this idea that, like, any person can just be heretical by existing.
Yeah.
So, because that is something that Vanitas definitely struggles with as well. Me and my partner rewatching the anime have been like talking about how incredibly transcoded Vanitas is as a character.
Yeah, yeah.
Just deeply transmasc vibes from Vanitas. Right down to how incredibly chunibyo he is with his stupid ball gloves.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong, Ray.
Love Vanitas. Love that asshole. That one I think will be finishing up sooner rather than later, so maybe we should add it to our list for series spotlights. We can talk about, I think just briefly, because we actually have done a deep dive on this series, but definitely worth mentioning in an episode about vampires is a favorite series of both me and G, which is Devil's Line. This series is excellent. This series is not talked about enough by enough people. It's really, really good.
Kodansha, I'm waiting for the sequel. You cannot not give me the sequel. Please, I need to know what happens 10 years later. I need to, it's part of my mental health self-care. Just give it to me.
Yep, I have. G knows that I gave in and bought the Japanese volumes of the sequel, and I'm now caught up on the sequel.
So bloody jealous.
And it's really good. And it has cult shit, so I know G's gonna love it.
Why do you torment me so, Kodansha? I don't ask for much in life. Truly, this is a personal blight on myself.
As we've mentioned, there is a sequel to this series, but we do have the entire original series in English from Vertical / Kodansha. It's 14 volumes. It's 13 plus a epilogue of sorts that's like following all the characters after the events of the main series. This series is like, speaking of shonen and seinen and like just non-romance vampire series manga in general, it is in large part a romance, but like if I was going to like put it in a genre section at the bookstore, like this is a political thriller.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's about our straight-laced cop protagonist Hansai. It starts off very much like a police procedural. He's dealing with police cases, having to deal with devils, which is our vampires in this world. When they see blood or are around blood, have a tendency to go into a frenzy like a shark, and just carnage ensues. Which has necessitated, even though devils do not officially exist, they are not officially recognized, people don't know about them, it has necessitated a secret squad in the Tokyo Metropolitan Police who are specialized in handling devil crimes. And that squad is made up of both humans and devils. Anzai is half devil, half human. He hates being half devil and he hates devils. So that's where we start at the beginning of the series. And he ends up having a fateful encounter with a college student named Tsukasa. And even though he feels like it's too dangerous for a human and a devil to be together in any capacity, they're drawn to each other as these things go. And they end up spending more and more time together. And we sort of see their relationship go where it goes, you know?
Mm-hmm.
As we start to, as the devil-related cases that Anzai and his squad are dealing with start to show themselves to be more connected than previously thought, and we start to uncover this vast conspiracy within the Japanese government. And there's like terrorism, and there's like revolutionaries, and political intrigue, and it's just a little bit ACAB. The sequel is very ACAB, which I'm enjoying.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. That's the best news I've heard all week.
Yes. It goes from there. It's a very well written sort of political conspiracy story. It's super well paced, super like intriguing and exciting all the way through from beginning to end. There's a lot of really good politics in the series. Ryo Hanada is definitely one of the good ones. Also, a queer creator who incorporates quite a few queer characters in their series. So that's good as well. It's just really good. And I feel like if you want to know more about our thoughts on the series and see more of a deep dive into it, check out our series spotlight episode on Devil's Line.
Yeah, because we literally spent over an hour just talking about how good it is. And everyone should read it. And it has a little bit of like, there's so much good stuff in there, but it is also a very compelling like romance story, aside from like all the revolution, all the like exposing bigotry and the horrible conspiracy within the government. It's just also like Anzai and Tsukasa are a great couple. I really enjoy
They're a great
them.
couple. They're both very like complex, interesting characters who grow a lot throughout the series, who grow together throughout the series.
Yes.
And it's just like, as we were talking about earlier, like, vampire fiction isn't necessarily where you're expecting to see a lot of like healthy, equitable relationships. But Tsukasa and Anzai are like goals. Hashtag goals.
Hashtag goals.
Like figuring out how to communicate well with each other. They're like navigating like consent and just like really and truly in love with each other, best friends, care about each other's lives and the things that each other like cares about.
Yeah.
Care about each other's growth, like, so with like where they are in their lives, like Tsukasa I think is like 22 or something, 21, 22.
Yeah, 22, 23.
Yeah, and then
a
little older, and then Anzai's 20 at the start of the series. So they're at that age where they're both sort of trying to figure out what they want to do for the rest of their lives. So it's really nice to see them sort of like propping each other up, like cheering each other on as they're kind of trying to figure out who they are. It's just wonderful. Like if you've been looking for like a good manga romance about young adults, like, forget all the vampires and the government stuff. Like these two are awesome.
And again, out of like all of the vampire romance stuff that there is around, including in manga, this is the one to read. Like, read this one.
If you want bodice-ripper vibes, but still like a pretty healthy relationship, like Vanitas. The relationship, Vanitas and Jean, they start off questionable, but like they do get cute, I promise. It's, you know, steamy in the way that you want your vampire stuff to be. Especially in the anime. Oh boy.
Yes, yeah.
Some animators were having fun. Well, we talked about all the het stuff, so we can talk about some more gay boys. How about the vampire and his pleasant companions?
Yes, I mean, if you're wanting like steamy stuff in that one,
Not really, no.
Not really. You're gonna be waiting a little while. Very asexual coded character in that one. If you're looking for the bodice ripper but with like dudes, this is not gonna be the one to pick up. I would say get Fangs instead. Fangs is very good and will satisfy you on that regard.
Fangs is great. I think we're getting like that one's only 2 volumes out right now. It comes out very slowly in Japanese. And I think was on hiatus for a while as well. I don't know. But yeah, very sexy, very steamy. Definitely R18 BL content there. But I love that series. I love how like you don't really go to BL for like good female characters.
Yeah.
Fangs has some great female characters, and including some female characters of the gay variety. And every single person in that series is so fucking hot.
Yes.
Regardless of gender.
If you're a struggling bisexual like Ray, then it certainly is a series for you. Are you alright? For those who don't know, because I will probably cut most of it out, Ray did just spend like a solid 2 minutes almost dying. She did choke on her drink, which just goes to show that I am correct in my assessment.
It's a struggle. It's truly hard. It's
but to that point, yes, if you are struggling bisexual like Ray, then you will enjoy this series. Fangs. It's got something for you. It's got something for you. You're not going to be disappointed. Even if you don't necessarily like the main couple, you know, the main characters, there's so many hot people in it. There's so many hot people.
So
Again,
many.
this is the vaguely hot European. That's just what vampires are. You can never be disappointed.
That said, the main couple is very cute.
Yes, yeah, I'm not complaining about main couple, but I'm saying like manga vampires aren't Nosferatu, or at least not normally, right? Mm-hmm. You're gonna end up with a hot person, and god damn it, that's what the people want. So yeah, absolutely. If you're wanting steamy and hot Fangs, if you're wanting something more that like gets more into the plot, more in like early stages of relationship building, and also like more in the lore of like vampires as well, the Vampire and His Pleasant Companion is very, very good. And was on hiatus for ages. It's back. I know Ray was very surprised when it came back off of hiatus because she had just assumed it ended really badly with a terrible cliffhanger.
And then guess what?
What?
I bought the most recent volume in Japanese and I read it.
Wow. To the surprise of no one.
Yeah, the series is really cute. It's got some very unique vampire lore. We've got our main character, Albert, who is from Nebraska. This is the creator of the series is Marimo Ragawa, who is also known for Baby and Me, as well as the BL series New York, New York, which we just got last year. And I put it very high up on my top 5 for the year. I think I put it as number 1 because G had claimed Shonen Note. If you've read New York, New York, you'll know that Nagawa has a very Hollywood understanding of America and Americans. That I would say that's still very much the case here. But anyway, so Albert he's from Nebraska. He got turned into a vampire by this chick he was like, I think gonna have like a one-night stand with, I don't know. And except that she fucked it up. She only did it halfway. So he turned into a vampire, but he's like a shitty fucked up vampire. Like Alan in the Folkland. So the vampires in this series, they can turn into bats at will. They can also take like other forms. They can turn into like mist, and they can turn into wolves. Albert can't do any of that shit. And he can only turn into a bat. And he doesn't will the transformation. It just happens when the sun comes up, whether he wants it to or not. So he turns into a bat at sunrise, and he turns back into a person at sunset every day. His bat form is the cutest.
Oh,
the
it's
cutest
so cute.
little manga animal you've ever seen in your life. He's
Guys,
adorable.
it's so freaking cute. It's so freaking cute.
Like, if nothing else convinces you to read this series, like, read it for the bat. Legit, so cute. But also, he doesn't have any fangs, so he's, like, he can't bite people and draw blood. So he kind of just hides out in this, like, meatpacking facility and, sucks all the blood off of the raw meat, and just lives a very pitiful existence. Obviously his family has abandoned him because he just sort of got buried in the ground and then showed up days later outside their house. Which would be a little unsettling, I think.
A little bit.
So he's been abandoned by everyone he loves, and he like can't go out during the day because he's a bat, and he's basically starving all the time because he just has to lap up the little bit of blood he can get from this raw meat from the meatpacking facility. And to make matters worse, one day, when he's a bat, he accidentally gets packed into a crate with a bunch of meat and frozen and shipped to Japan. And of course he wakes up when the sun goes down as a buck naked, like full-grown man, and is immediately arrested. And then escapes in the morning when he turns into a bat. Because, like, he can't explain his situation to the police even if he wants to, because he doesn't speak a word of Japanese.
Yeah, he's just like a Nebraskan teen. He has no idea. He's just like, oh god, I don't even know what country I'm in, right? Like, that truly nightmare. Truly a nightmare.
Stop talking gibberish, I only speak English. He's got a very American attitude about speaking Japanese.
Which is not unrealistic, let's be honest.
Look, I didn't say it was unrealistic. Especially, he's from, like, small town Nebraska. He's this, like, white kid. Like, Eventually, like, various hijinks ensue, and he ends up sort of as a bat. They don't realize that the pervert in the cell is the same person as the bat, obviously, because who would assume that? um, so, when they catch this little bat, one of the police officers, his name is Nukadia, is like, this bat is adorable. Hey, I have a weird friend who, like, could use a little bit of comfort in his life, to be honest. He's kind of emo.
We're all
and he likes
bats.
Him. He likes bats. So, he takes this bat to his friend, Akira. I forget his last name. But, and Akira is super delighted by the bat, and takes it in and is, like, playing with its ears and, like, playing with its little wings and his little hands. And he works nights, so he leaves to go work his night shift. He works as an embalmer, which is a rare profession in Japan because most bodies are cremated in Japan. So it's an unusual profession that he has. He comes back, and there's this naked man stealing his prime rib, like, in his house. And he's like, what the hell? And so Albert ends up in jail again.
There is a strange man who is just yelling at me in English. I have no idea what's going on, why he's here.
He's saying this because Akira does speak English. And he's saying this weird stuff about turning into a bat, but all I know is I came home in the middle of the night, and this naked American man was here yelling at me, trying to steal my expensive meat. So, we'll skip the rest of the hijinks and say that eventually Albert does end up living with Akira. And ends up taking a job working as, like, a janitor at this embalming place. And, like, their relationship, like, grows and deepens as time goes on. Albert is pretty quick to recognize that his feelings are turning to the romantic towards Akira, but Akira is a very shut-off kind of person. He's also very, very asexual coded.
Yes. Yeah.
So, we'll see how that goes. Obviously, he cares for Al a whole lot, even if he doesn't want to admit it. Nucadia's over here on the side, just, like, playing Cupid for both of them. And, yeah, also other, like, vampire shenanigans ensue. The most recent volume majorly features, the vampire who not the vampire who turned Al, the vampire who helped him after he was turned. It's a very funny series. It's, like, laugh out loud funny. So
hilarious.
There's a bit of gore in it, because it's about vampires, but although I will say, like, when Al, like, gets, like, the shit kicked out of him when he's in his human form, I'm like, that's fine. But it does happen to him once when he's in the bat form, and that was really hard. That was really hard to read about.
Animal abuse warnings for those who care. It's a rough time.
The list of titles that I can talk about goes on and on, but are there any in particular that you, like, want to spotlight before we go into our questions?
Not particularly. We've mentioned a lot of the vampire manga that I've read, just because I haven't read nearly as much as you have. I'm also fairly particular, so I can't say that, like, from the top of my head I can think of anything that we haven't mentioned yet. Before we get into, like, questions from Twitter, I did want to ask, because, as said, you've read a whole variety of vampire manga. Is there anything, like, any particular series aside from that which shall be not be named, that you just are, like, really dislike, don't have any interest in engaging with, actively hate, that kind of thing?
So let's see. I've read a lot of vampire series, and that means that I've read a lot of bad ones. So one that I kind of won't touch on principle is Dance in the Vampire Bund.
Yeah.
I just don't want to. I don't want to deal with that. You can tell me, like, she's actually 600 years old and, like, actually the plot's really interesting all you want. Y'all can keep that one. Otherwise, like, I've read all of Vampire Knight. That one's bad. It's compelling in a way, but I could do without the incest.
Right, that's half the fun of Vampire Knight, from my understanding.
I mean, you're not wrong. I will just keep it to it's not for me, you know? It's not for me. It's definitely very, like, domineering men, like, having and relinquishing control to men who know better for you, which is not my fetish. So, you know what? The people who that's for can have it. Midnight Secretary I've read. It's just very generic. Again, domineering man. This is, like, the Josei variety, so he's, like, the CEO and she's, like, his dowdy secretary. And, you know, they have a lot of sex or whatever. Like, it's a lot of, like, boring stuff, right?
Yeah.
I'm not interested in diabolic lovers. That's very much, like, if you're into, like, BDSM and specifically, like, guys abusing the shit out of you. Like, it's for that. Like, and I'm not gonna kink shame people who are into that. Like, that series exists for people who are into that, and that's fine. It's not my kink, and that's okay. Yeah. Otherwise, Rose and Blood is a similar one that's, like, girl gets locked in a mansion with reverse harem full of sexy vampires who are kind of mean to her. So again, not really my thing. Seraph of the End is somehow my thing, but it's not something I recommend. It is a mess.
Yeah.
It has dinosaurs in it for some reason.
Do the dinosaurs make it better or worse? Because a lot of people would argue that it would make it, like, dinosaurs as just a function typically make things better, right? But does it make your vampire manga worse to include dinosaurs?
It made me laugh, and that was the first time in a while that Seraph at the End has made me feel anything. So,
well, okay, that's good.
I'm just in it to see if the two boys kiss, and they're not going to, but I keep reading in the vain hope that they will.
Yeah, I mean, fair.
Yeah, I think that's about it. There's a bunch of others that are just, like, boring that I've read. Black Rose Alice is kind of interesting, but I feel like if you're gonna read a Satana Mizushiro manga, you'd better go with After School Nightmare. That's way more interesting. Yeah. And it's been on hiatus forever.
It's for so long. I actually, when you were talking through that list, I was like, oh, that's the other one that I've read, and it is interesting, but it's just been on hiatus for so long. It's not really worth it.
Yeah.
If you want a conclusion, it's you're better going on to other things.
I do think it's interesting that the vampires are full of bugs that crawl out of their orifices in the middle of the night to go find blood for them. That's pretty sick.
It's sort of similar to the moss thing in #DRCL.
Yeah.
Was that? Yeah. Just like a new or different way of interpreting blood sucking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun. We love monsters who are just full of bugs.
That's the read right to left guarantee.
Yeah, otherwise, Killing Me is like a pretty generic Yuri. It's only one volume and it's cute. Chibi Vampire's boring and old. I don't know. There's not enough blood sucking in it, so it's like boring. Vampire Dormitory is boring, and shoujo, I don't know, it's not that interesting. Like, I've read a lot of like schlock, so
yeah.
Actually, the Cirque du Freak manga is surprisingly good. It's got an interesting art style, and it's a fun read, memorable. So, you know, check that out if it interests you, I guess. But yeah. And then I've read like a whole bunch of like vampire series, especially like BL in Japanese. That is not in English. Oh, there's a couple that are in English. There's a Haruko Kumoto one called When We Were in the Rose Forest. It's a one shot and it's really beautiful. So, she's really good, obviously. We have a dedicated episode on Showagen no Gurakugo Shinju, so.
Yes.
But she has a one shot that's about vampires, and it's quite good. And the other one is a recent one called The Black Cat and the Vampire. It's licensed by Tokyo Pop, set in a boys' boarding school. It's very vibes, and it's super cute. So, there you go. All right, questions.
Questions.
Just a couple this time, and we already answered the one from at Sunlit Lake, so thank you for that one. We'll go to our unofficial moderator at Storied Shelves. Asks us a couple questions. Which depiction of vampires did you find the most interesting? Is their first question.
I like anything that can play with from the typical vampire tropes, I guess. I find, as mentioned, like a different interpretation of a very classic monster, like in Black Rose Alice, or like in DRCL, #DRCL, where it's not just like a guy who or girl who comes and bites your neck and you know feasts on your blood. There's a little bit of that body horror aspect. Is always cool and interesting and fun. I, in a similar sense, like we've made the argument that like Devil's Line fits into vampire fiction. They're not technically vampires in the same way that like Dracula is. But I do like that interpretation of the story. Similarly, like Tokyo Ghoul is very much that like, oh, they're monsters and they're inhuman and they feast on people, but they're not like vampire. We don't use this. It's not exactly the same.
Our vampires are different.
They're different. They don't have as much Catholic guilt, you know?
Yeah.
Which is really the main difference. For a more classic kind of vampire, or a more classic setting of the vampire or vampire myth, I do really enjoy the vampire and his pleasant companion, which is just a really fun way of doing that. Also, I like the kind of social coven style, social style of how Fangs is done. I think that's a really
yeah.
smart way of incorporating vampires into like modern society. I mean, we've waxed poetic over like all of these vampires already, so I enjoy them all in very different ways. But yeah, it's just they're all good, but they're all good for like slightly different reasons, and it means you get a lot of variety in this type of story you're reading. I like a lot of vampires in manga that I've read because it is a very unique Japanese take on what is ostensibly a quote unquote European yokai, right? Like, I feel like a lot of vampire media from the US and England and Europe is very set on like the Bram Stoker's, you know, Dracula, or maybe Nosferatu, right? Where it does have this very highly religious element where it's very much like, oh, they must be invited in, and they you know, they don't have a reflection. And a lot of Japanese vampires certainly have that aspect, but it's like some of them just don't kind of hand wave some of those rules and are like, they aren't weak to garlic, they just don't like it, right? Like, there's a lot more flexibility in the interpretation, which is what you're gonna get when you have this cross-cultural interpretation.
I mean, I think we sort of curate. At least I curated. I just told you how many like boring and bad series I've also read that have vampires in them. So I'm very much talking about like a curated list of the best that I've read of vampires and manga throughout this podcast. So I think you can kind of assume that if it's a series we talked about in depth throughout this episode, like, I like the vampires in it. I think the vampire is pretty sick. I do want to shout out Tokyo Ghoul, which you mentioned. I thought about whether to include it as a series to talk about in depth, but I think it sort of straddles the line where it's sort of more in line with this really recent trend of like cannibal series, which is sort of a furthering of vampire fiction, making it more grotesque, combining it with like zombie lore, which I think is an interesting trend in itself. But there's certainly like a lot of overlap with vampire series with that series with Tokyo Ghoul. And I do really like the lore in it. I think the ghouls are cool. I think they're interesting. I think they're unique. And then I do really like, obviously, the Vampirella in the Folkland. But, like, I like that you mentioned, like, the classic lore of, like, not having a reflection or having to be invited in. The Vampirella don't have to be invited in, but what I like about them is that they have to consciously think about having a reflection or not being, like, taken aback at the sight of a crucifix. For them, like, appearing human, pretending to have a pulse and breath, it's something that they can do, but they have to think about it. Which to me, like, really adds to this sort of queer subtext of, like, you know, sure, I can pretend to be something other than what I am, you know, and survive that way, but it's hard. Like, it requires constant vigilance and work. And it's exhausting, and you get tired even if you don't realize that you're masking, you are. And I really like that aspect of the Vampirella, that they have this sort of like, you know, that they can overcome the classic weaknesses of vampires, but they have to think about it. They have to work. They have to be conscious of it and vigilant of it at all times. I think that's compelling. I'm going to mention Vanitas as well, for the reason that you mentioned. I just think that this idea of just the vampires being just sort of a mathematical glitch in the system is really interesting. There's a lot of like super chunibyo like layers to the lore here with like the curse bearers and like, you know, everybody's got super extra like code names for everything.
Hell yeah.
So that's fun. There's also a lot of like folklore being incorporated, like the Beast of Shavodan is one of the first major arcs. which is fun. So, yeah. But I would say if we talked about it in depth, then I like the vampires in it. I think they're interesting. The other question from at Storied Shelves is sort of a two-parter. Which series have your favorite outfits, and which have your favorite art style? Well, my favorite art style is Monohagi.
Yeah, I mean, was that a question to ask? Aside from Hagia, who obviously is a queen and a classic, I do. I mean, and we talked about it as well. The art style, the hyper realism in DRCL is beautifully done. A really great way of showing all the various aspects of that series.
It's just lush.
It is lush. Gorgeous. It's one of those series that like it's too gender to be like popular with the people who get manga tattoos, but like it's one of those series that would fit in that kind of vibe. It's like, oh, I want a panel as a sick tattoo.
It's very more is more, which I always appreciate.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Vanitas, I really like Mochizuki's art style. I think it lends itself well to the setting.
And it's just like, it feels like a graduation of her art style. Like, what was good in Pandora Hearts is great in Vanitas. So.
Well, what certainly like grew to become excellent in Pandora Hearts, because that series had a bit of a rough early start, as most early works do. There was a huge evolution of art over the course of that series. It just means that from the get-go, Vanitas was just amazing and beautiful.
Yep. I also really like Mari Moragawa's style. I think there's a warmth to it that's very pleasant on the eyes. And also shout out Shuzo Oshimi, who is just an incredible artist. Very much knows what he's trying to accomplish with his work and accomplishes it with flying colors. It's
absolutely
super trippy, super fun. Outfits. Vanitas. Everyone's super smartly dressed in Vanitas all the time. One more thing that I wanted to shout out is, in terms of fashion, is predictably for me again, the Po Clan. Especially because it does have a Takarazuka adaptation, and Takarazuka has their own in-house costume designers. Whenever I read the manga now, I'm just thinking about the like Takarazuka interpretations of those costumes, like Edgar's classic like silk shirt and velvet like leggings that he's got going on. Stunningly beautiful in the musical adaptation.
What a move.
So,
what a look.
What a look. It's very like Victorian child. But hey, put it on a grown woman and it is a fucking look, okay?
Alright.
So the last question that we have, I just realized I should have this is a very professional podcast, so had I been checking these beforehand, I would have realized this is sort of a double up. But at Whimsy Dearest asks, what's your favorite interpretation on vampires in a manga? Like what they are and their origins. We already answered that with a prior question that was very similar. So I think that means we are done.
And with that, absolutely, we are finished. Hopefully everyone enjoyed those answers. It's a really fun topic, one that has been on the list for a while, one that I know that Ray in particular certainly was looking forward to, because it is certainly in her topics of interest. So
Indeed.
I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you everyone who sent in your questions as per usual. Next month we are doing a series spotlight for another very beloved podcast favorite. That is, of course, classic shoujo series Rose of Versailles. We will be talking all about it, so be sure to send in your questions if you have any. We will put out the post on Twitter again if it still exists, where it's clinging to life.
We just never know.
We never know. And I kind of refuse to create any more social media if and when it dies. So we'll figure something out after that. But for now, if you are wanting to follow any updates on the podcast, if you're wanting to send in your questions, you can follow me at Twitter, nay X. That is at GEE_reads. Be sure to also follow Ray on her Twitter at Whimsical Pics. That's PIX, all one word. You can also find this podcast on all of the different podcasting platforms that still exist. Spotify has eaten most of them, but Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts still exist. So if you want to listen on those platforms, you can. You can also find this podcast on my YouTube channel, Simply G. I think that's 2 words. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But if you're wanting to follow along and subscribe to the podcast, you can on YouTube there. You can also find my somewhat regular video updates. Ray also has a YouTube channel, Whimsical Pictures. I don't know if you've posted anything there in a long time, but the back catalog is good, so be sure to watch it. Yeah, that's it. Is that anything from you, Ray, before we sign out?
Vive la révolution.
A lot of revolution on this podcast. And if you're not up for it, then I don't know why you're hanging around. Follow us on all of those platforms. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll catch you next month in November. Bye till then.
Bye, guys.